for being a perfect host. I'm going to introduce the speakers in a moment, but I want to tell you why we're here tonight with a series of slides that give you the overall concept of the exhibition, Millennium, Lower Manhattan in the 1990s, and in particular, the first inspiration for this project, which was a very significant public history project in the second half of the 90s, around 1995 through 2000, Heritage Trails, New York. And I won't do it justice in the couple of minutes that I have here, but you do have a brochure that was on a lot of the chairs back there, which explains how the Skyscraper Museum has resuscitated this project and created a digital footprint for Heritage Trails where you can take the walking tour and find some of the original markers, but none of the original signs, as I'll show you in a moment, and take one of 4 tours of downtown. That was really the first, or possibly you could describe as the second effort to tell history on the streets of New York through a walking tour, in the same way that Boston is so famous for its Freedom Trail, but New York did not have a version of that. And it was Richard Kaplan that you see here from the narrative that's on our website that tells the story of Heritage Trails. And unfortunately, it's now about 2 years since Richard passed away, but in 95 and 96 and through the end of the millennium, he and Lex Lally, who's here in the audience, and a team of many other people led this effort to make this series of trail markers and to tell the history downtown. So this evening and the exhibition is really inspired by Richard's effort, and it was supported by the J.M. Kaplan Fund as well, so we're very grateful for that. And this is the project that we recreated from old cork files that you couldn't read anymore, so we really had to do digital archaeology in order to even make these panels again. And then you see on the left the original panel, you see on the right the 2017 that tells the history, the catch-up history of downtown from 1998, when the first panels of Heritage Trails were completed, to the present day. And there are plenty of examples that you'll see in the show, and one later in another slide, about the surviving panels, the only original one of which is in the 9/11 Memorial Museum. It survived the fall of the towers just across the street in front of Century 21, and it is a kind of tragic remembrance of that. What we realized in doing these kind of last 2 decades of history, the 20 years since Heritage Trails was established, was the history of the last 20 years is so consequential in so many ways, so different in the technologies that were available, but yet the buildings of downtown, largely because of landmarks, and we have 2 former landmarks commissioners here to talk about their efforts, is still identifiable. Downtown is still identifiable, and that's a little bit of what I want to talk about. My own personal history, situated in the mid-1990s, was starting the Skyscraper Museum with our first exhibition in 1997 at 44 Wall Street. This is the wonderful poster that Pentagram, Michael Garricky, made for us. And in 1998, we had our second location, and you can see our sign on 14 Wall Street, on the corner of the Bankers Trust Building, which in 1912, when it was completed, 1910 when they started to build this and they tore another skyscraper down, was the most expensive land conveyance in the history of the world per square foot, to that date. In 1999, I occupied it for free. So the importance of real estate cycles in urban history is really significant. So here's one of the first 2 exhibitions that we did in that great space, the banking hall, which has now since been ruined by a commercial gym. The second, in the larger part of the space, and all of this interior, Art Deco interior, like a big thermidor and with exotic woods, has since been destroyed. But this is the banking hall that was done in the revamping of the first building in 1930, 31, and 32. And this was the exhibition, Big Buildings, that we did in that space. So from our first show, our downtown New York, the architecture of business, the business of buildings, we looked at Lower Manhattan and the history of the skyscraper that started there. And now 20 years later, here we are tonight doing exactly the same thing. We've done some other things in the meantime. But this particular show is revisiting that history of which the Skyscraper Museum is a part. This is at the top of the ramp in our now permanent home in Battery Park City, and it shows you, this is a photograph of a photograph, right? The Heritage Trails marker of the World Trade Center that tells you how many elevators there were and how many tons of steel were used in order to create the World Trade Center. That is one of the most tragic of the markers. Some would tell a history that isn't changed much to this day. So just as to whet your appetite if you haven't seen the show, a few images, the wonderful model of Battery Park City, and of course the Skyscraper Museum is located in the southern end of Battery Park City. And contrasting that Battery Park City model on the Hudson River side with the East River development is one of the things that we do in the show. So we talk about the two edges of the two rivers development and the central core. The changes in Lower Manhattan in the 1980s and into the early 90s, you can see in the gigantic behemoth towers that are the back office buildings. They're kind of marching up Water Street and until they hit the South Street Seaport and the Fulton Fish Market that you can see this building being torn down as we speak, the old New Market building. And even this building, the Rouse Urban Festival Market, has been redone just recently by shops. So there's been a lot of urban change and urban history on this East River side of the city. But one of the themes for tonight is historic preservation, and one of the very important movements of the 60s forward, especially the 1990s, is the way that downtown was preserved by government action. Here, just to show you the last fisherman, I thought it was the last trawler that actually brought fish by boat to the Fulton Fish Market in the late 80s, and a little bit of what is going to be reestablished. Of course, politics are very much involved in all of this, and the Giuliani administration, which is right in the middle of the period that we're talking about, and Joe Rose was the city planning commissioner at that point. But it was very important to Mayor Giuliani to try to clean up the Fulton Fish Market, and he imposed regulations against the resistance, the local resistance there, which was the mafia. And this was the day that, and a photograph of the fire that happened to take place on the morning that the regulations by the city were imposed for like work rules or delivery rules for the fire. So there was ad hoc change on the East River side. There was regulatory and policy change. But what happened was very different than happened with the master plan of the Hudson River side and Battery Park City. And so now if we just look really briefly at the core, the changes that were coming to downtown were part of a concerted effort of public policy that was stimulated in response to, and I forgot to say this at the beginning, the real estate market situation and the important sectoral changes that were happening in the financial district at the time. So the reason the Skyscraper Museum had that free space at the end of the 20th century is that there was no market for real estate whatsoever. Buildings couldn't trade because after the stock market crashed and then the continuation of the savings in 1987, the continuation of the savings and loan crisis, there was no real estate lending. So the vacancy rate in Lower Manhattan rose to almost 30%. And that was the reason that I could have free space on Wall Street in two different places, because there was no market for real estate. I was on a 30-day cancellation clause. Sure, you can use the space, we can't use it for anything else. That was the situation. So if I were doing an hour lecture, and I'm already talking too long, I would have told you all of those things in the setup, but I kind of failed to do that at the beginning here. But just to conclude with the point about landmarks, because that will segue into our first two speakers. This was a project that shows very clearly just how threatened the historic core of the financial district was. This was a project for a new home for the New York Stock Exchange in 1999. SOM was hired to design the building, and the base building would have been a new trading floor for the exchange, and the tower above would have paid for that space because the city was going to acquire the land, and they were going to build the new home for the New York Stock Exchange. This had the support of Mayor Giuliani, and it was the effort that was underway in 1999 and continued up until 2001, where everything changed. That was in the face of changes to markets and trading that was so apparent, but yet the New York Stock Exchange and others seem to be oblivious to the changes of electronic markets and the needlessness of actual place, of being at a center that became the clear reality in the late 1990s. So this is the digital space that was designed by Asymptote Architects in order to make an electronic trading floor, also in 1999. Just to show James Sanders' wonderful project for Liberty Plaza that would have turned inside out these financial service buildings and made zippers and all along Liberty Plaza, now called Zuccotti Park. And of course, the title for tonight's event is When Wall Street Was Unoccupied, which refers to the vacancy rate, right, and the programs for residential conversion, and helps us to turn the tables like 180 degrees in the situation that exists today. And one of the questions that Lynne is going to ask us as we moderate the panel is, would things have changed in the same ways absent 9/11? There were lots of big projects and big ideas about how to change and reinvent downtown. One was for the Frank Gehry Guggenheim. Some of you will remember this project, and Laurie Beckelman certainly does, because she was shepherding this project along through the government for the Guggenheim. And finally, the immense accomplishment of the late 90s in succeeding in landmarking buildings. These, at the tip of Lower Manhattan, 25 individual landmarks and a historic district were accomplished under Jennifer Raab, who will talk a little bit about that. And here's some of the buildings that were saved in simply 3 slides, and she will show you some other slides later after Laurie speaks. But as you can see, these include large-scale commercial buildings, the greatest skyscrapers of their times, like the Bankers Trust Building, which is this one in the lower right-hand corner. They were very significant investments by their owners, and Jennifer will describe how she managed to convince commercial real estate owners that landmarking was a good idea, that regulation was a good idea, rather than the resistance that had been the history up until that time. So that is, and here are some other of those buildings that make the identity, that make Lower Manhattan still identifiable at a time when, as you could see from that SOM design for the New York Stock Exchange, it was under a true and urgent threat of being dramatically changed. So those are some of the ideas that the exhibition deals with, and they were the policies that were practiced and lived and implemented by the people who are here tonight. So since I left my profiles that I had carefully printed out on the floor of my office, the order of the speaking tonight reproduces the public agency or commission chronology in which these people operated. So first to speak will be Laurie Beckelman, who was the chairman of the Landmarks Preservation Commission from 1990 to 1995. She has worked in many other areas of not-for-profit management. She was at the Landmarks Conservancy before that, before she came to the Government Commission. And she now is a consultant, but also leading the Shed, the project over in Hudson Yards. So she has, as everyone here, has had a long career both in government and in not-for-profits and in and out. Jennifer Raab is now currently the president of Hunter College. She was the Landmarks Preservation Chair from 1995 and through 2001, and when she went off to Hunter. And Jennifer gets the prize tonight for having the most assistants take care of getting you here for the evening. So that speaks to the lifetime accomplishments of Jennifer. She gets the gold star for this evening. Joe Rhodes was the commissioner, the chairman, and the chairman of the City Planning Commission and the Department of City Planning. He served in the Giuliani administration from 1994 through 2001 and had many initiatives across the city, but very significant ones for the changes that were implemented in Lower Manhattan. And Carl Weisbrod, of course, has recently been and left the chair of the Department of City Planning, but back in 1995, he left the presidency of the Economic Development Corporation, EDC, in order to take over the job as the head of the Alliance for Downtown New York, the biggest bid in New York and the initiating organization downtown. And Lynne Sagalyn, who will act as the moderator for this evening after the speakers talk for a lot less time than I have just talked, so that we can quickly get into a discussion amongst themselves, because I think one of the things that really marks this period of the 90s was born of the desperation of the situation, of the need of changing and reinventing Lower Manhattan, was a cross-agency collaboration in order to get things done. So I hope they'll speak to that. But Lynne Sagalyn is an excellent person to bring that out. She is just very recently Emerita professor at the graduate school, Columbia School of Business. And she has written books on Times Square, but most germane to this evening. Just last year published Power at Ground Zero. So putting downtown before the Millennium and after 9/11 is I can think of no one who could speak better to that. So Laurie, will you please take over?
I love being a consultant working on cultural projects and not-for-profit, but when I had this opportunity to help create this something now we call the Shed, which was the Culture Shed, which started in the Bloomberg administration. So I'm now the associate director working full-time, and it'll open in the middle of 2019. My life started at the Municipal Art Society and working for Margot Wellington, who's also in the audience. I came down to Lower Manhattan, and Carol Clark she was the associate director, reminded me how I really did not want to commute down here to 11 Broadway. She told me before I started that there were rats in the bathroom, and I remember that it was just so unwelcoming. And at the same time, the Landmarks Conservancy had been involved with from Jim Wolfenson to John Loeb to Senator Moynihan in saving the old Custom House, IMK, et cetera. I can go on and on. So we created an exhibition downtown and did all these wonderful things. And then when I became the chair of the Landmarks Commission, I was always fascinated by Lower Manhattan. My original boss in preservation had been Kent Barwick at the Municipal Art Society, and when he became head of the Landmarks Commission, and that would have been in the 1970s, he desperately tried to designate some buildings, just individuals, and he couldn't get them done, couldn't get it through the Board of Estimate. And so when I became the chair under Mayor Dinkins, we no longer had a Board of Estimate, but the City Council. And at the time, unless it looked like a landmark or smelled like a landmark and you could figure out that it was a landmark, there was going to be no way we could do very much of this. And I also felt at the time, as much as I really did fall in love with Lower Manhattan, and one of the first things I did do was designate the Woolworth building as a landmark, the interior. And I was threatened, I don't mean my life, but that I could lose my job because the economy was so terrible. How could I be thinking about doing anything to hurt? And I was not being considered anything to revitalize Lower Manhattan. And in addition to that, I remember when I did take the job, I wasn't even sure I wanted to work in government, although preservation was in my blood and my passion. I kept thinking, all right, most of the people that were in Manhattan did not vote for Mayor Dinkins. And who were they? They were in other boroughs. they were in areas that nobody was looking at or didn't think were of value. So I remember talking to people on the commission, let's go and look at other areas of the city that maybe would be easier to designate and that would in a way connect. So I thought Harlem, where I got murdered because I wasn't from there and we didn't do what many people wanted to do. We went to other areas, a little more successful. And then came back at the end really to Lower Manhattan. And one of the things that we did designate was the African burial ground. And if you recall, it was at a time when the city was in desperate shape financially. There had been, terrible problems, race problems, et cetera. And then for the first time, here we are, the African burial ground. It's federally owned. There's nothing we really could do. And I remember saying to Barbara Fife, we have to do, this is the first African-American mayor. You have to demand that I hold a hearing on this. I legally can't do anything, it's only advisory, but we have to make a statement. And she said, you can't do this to the mayor, this is, we finally have activity, there's a large building going up, there's nothing that we can do. So she was out of town. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm definitely gonna lose my job, I'm gonna resign, there's nothing I can do. And I asked an emergency meeting to see the mayor. And I went to see him and I said, I know that you're going to ask me to resign and I'm fine, but I can't live with myself.
Can you speak up, please?
Yes.
Sorry.
I said,
She's not listening now.
Can you hear? Can you hear? It's all right if she was. She's still a friend. And I remember saying to her, saying to him, this situation, you have to demand that I hold a hearing on this. And let me explain why. And we have to get the federal government involved and we should get John Lewis to hold a hearing here, and we did. And he came and he demanded a hearing, et cetera, and we designated it. But before that, the mayor said, fine, you're going to call Barbara Fife and you're going to tell her this is what we're doing. And then in a half an hour, we're going to hold a press conference, which we did. She was furious. I didn't lose my job. We did this and got more and more and more people involved. I'm not satisfied the way it was designated, the way it's not talked about. Most people in schools still don't know what it's about. And it really started with, what was the name of the Manhattan Borough president who died many, many years before? Irish. Joe, you know what I'm thinking of?
Paula Dwyer.
It was Paula Dwyer, who actually was the first person who knew about the African burial ground. And it was before landmarks even that he was talking about. I remember reading some history. But when we started looking again at landmarks, and when I was at the Conservancy years before, there was a great effort. I think Harold Clark and others had put together lists and lists of buildings down here, and there was a great interest, especially with a number of members of the board who were from the Wall Street community, Bob Douglas and others. And I remember thinking about Stone Street. We did a report. I think we held a hearing. And then by this point, I'm working for Mayor Giuliani. And I reported to Fran Ryder, who was, I think, very willing to take lots of chances, was very interested. Different groups were coming together within the city. And I think what Carol mentioned, which is really important, is this cross-agency collaboration, which I didn't feel we necessarily had. I don't think I did that well in the Dickens administration doing that. And what I saw in the Giuliani administration is that really started. And then I left, and Jennifer Raab took over. And I must say that the relationship that she had with Joe Rose, head of city planning, with Carl and others, is because of the creative effort that they had together, that they were able to persuade, I believe, the mayor, and persuade others that this was the right tact to take. It was risky, it was ambitious, and they did it. And I really believe that if they did not have those relationships, that would have ever happened. So I just wanted to remind you, I did this book years ago when we did I think we first had the Democratic Convention, and then you took over, and I did a couple of them. But when I was at the Landmarks Commission, and you look at this, there were 20 landmarks in Lower Manhattan, 20 individual, 3 historic districts, Francis Tavern Block, the African Burial Ground, and the South Street Seaport. Oh, and then we had the street plan of New Amsterdam and Colonial New York. But that was it. We couldn't touch anything. So anyway, I'll stop there, and then I'm hoping we'll get into a discussion.
Thank you so much, Laurie, for then and for now. I think Carol and Laurie touched on it. It was a really extraordinary time in '94 when we all started on this idea of focusing on Lower Manhattan. Lower Manhattan was defined as the third largest business district in the country and one of the most significantly depressed. And Carol, you mentioned so many of the indicators in the market that got us to that point, but I believe one thing that wasn't really touched on was the irony of the fact that the World Trade Center itself caused so many tenants to leave the Class B office buildings and move into the World Trade Center. So that really the sad irony of that. But that left us, as you said, so many of these really unbelievable historic jewels, incomparable buildings, and with such vacancy issues. And it was the focus of Carl and Joe and other really sort of visionary people around Giuliani who said, this third largest business district, this area in Manhattan can't be left in this depressed state. As the Landmarks Commissioner coming in, this allowed me to do something that I had hoped to do for preservation, which was ease the tension that had so often engulfed preservation of the us and the them. Either you're a preservationist and you want to save a building, or you're an owner or a developer or someone in real estate, and you have to fight preservation. So the concept here was, could we make historic preservation part of the argument to improve the economic development of Lower Manhattan? And the answer was ultimately, with Joe and Carl's help, the answer was yes. And it was one of the most significant breakthroughs, both for, I think, Lower Manhattan, but also for the trajectory of preservation in New York City. Because we were showing not just the value those of us who are preservationists see in saving beautiful gems of architecture, but also saying that these beautiful gems of architecture attract people to areas. They bring tenants into buildings, they raise property values, that there is a really sound economic development benefit to landmarking. Laurie had set this groundwork. She didn't give herself enough credit. She had done a lot of work identifying the jewels. And so we knew there wasn't a lot of mystery. And I'll just talk about, I have a couple of them, they're individual buildings. 20 Exchange Place, just you look at the detail in a building like this, you think about it unprotected. Next one, well, I think perhaps one of my favorite, 25 Broadway, the Cunard Building, which was, you still should go see the lobby. It was one of the interiors we were able to do. The theory was you came to buy your ticket for the cruise ship, for the steamship, and you should already feel like you were in Europe when you walked in to buy the ticket. So this extraordinary lobby, which is now an event space, and that's the beautiful lobby. And those are just two of the just incredible gems. And so we made a commitment, and we approached this with, as Laurie said, we were building on a sense of real negative approach to landmarking anything in Lower Manhattan. So the argument was this was part of the economic development. A second argument, and something I feel very strongly about, wished I could have done more and urged all of you in this field to continue to espouse, was to actually get tax benefits for preservation. So with Joe and Carl's support, and this really was a team effort, we were able to convince both City Hall and the City Council that any building or area that was landmarked during this period would get an extra year of the tax breaks that were being given as part of the economic development plan for Lower Manhattan. That was the first, and I should say only, tax break given it to New York City landmarks for being landmarks. And as I said, it's something I wish we could do more of, because it helps to say to the owner, we're giving you some economic support for the work that you have to do. And we also did something that I think has been institutionalized at Landmark, is to work with the owners to give them a sense of certainty about the process, because part of what Laurie was facing was sort of the demons of preservations. It's going to be terrible. You won't be able to change anything. We won't be able to do anything. It'll be a terrible process. The answer will always be no. So we approached the owners. We made a list of 21 of the most significant buildings, and I think, as you said, Carol, even more have been done by now. And we talked to the owners about how they would be regulated. And one of my favorites, I might as well tell the story, was, of course, 40 Wall Street, which at that point, because it was such a cheap building, was bought by one Donald Trump, who immediately said, don't worry, it's going to be great. I'm going to gild the top of the building. well, actually, you're not. And actually, it's going to be great. I'm going to do it. And so, well, you're not. It's patented copper. It's very significant, and you're kind of not. And then there was the base of the building, which was a very beautiful but simple limestone. But don't worry, I'm going to put this beautiful marble from Italy. It's the most gorgeous thing. Don't worry. It's like, well, actually, you're not. So if you look at 40 Wall Street, didn't happen, was landmark. One of the great things, I think actually Margot may have been there. Donald actually came down to the hearing and got a standing ovation for having the building landmark. So it's one of those interesting New York moments. But the theory worked. You gave a sense of certainty versus that fear of owners that this will not work, that this will be oppressive, that this will be bad. One of the things I remember, Laurie, that I found the irony, because it's the kind of thing where you can't please everyone. We had picked that list of 21. We were approaching owners. We were making progress. We were doing things that, as Laurie said, you couldn't do. Being part of the effort, Joe and Carl are leading the economic development, working with owners, having a sense of certainty. And I remember Bob Stern coming out and saying, 21, that's outrageous. That's just not enough. It's not enough. And this theory of you just can't win, right? So that article also exists in the New York Times. But to sum up, to go on to, I think, one of the biggest triumphs of preservation and one of the most extraordinary examples of how economic development and preservation could go hand in hand is what Carl Weisbrod and I, when he was at the Lower Manhattan development bid, and landmarks were able to do in Stone Street. So actually, I forgot one Wall Street, which is also another favorite. If you have never seen that lobby, I mean, it is the example of an incredible deco lobby. It's open to the public, you can see it. And again, Laurie talked about how hard it was to do landmarks. Doing interior landmarks has always been one of the most difficult things because owners feel like you won't be able to make any adjustments that you need. And again, working and saying we'll be able to do ADA, we'll be able to repaint. These are just myths. Here's the reality of what regulation looks like. We were able to do one Wall Street, which is really pretty amazing. So Stone Street, which is right between where the Goldman Sachs building is on Broad Street and South William and Hanover Square, was called Stone Street because it was the oldest paved street in New York City. And it had become really a derelict place. There was a lot of drug dealing, it was dangerous. And Carl and I, and he'll talk a little bit more about this, really cooked up this idea that if we could bring this beautiful, really perfect historic district back and create a historic district that was regulated in a way that worked for owners, and that we also brought in some public investment to the amenities in the area, and we provided a regulated plan that was simple and predictable and clear for the owners, we could do a transformation. And it has been and remains extraordinarily successful. So this wonderful curved street of buildings from the late 1800s into the early 1900s was designated as a district. Carl used the bid finances to support Landmark's work in two ways. First, he did commission an economic development report to talk about what type of uses these wonderful buildings could have, and talk to look at this, such a wonderful historic streetscape. So we had a sense of what kind of restaurants, what kind of shops, so we can give owners and potential owners a sense of the commercial possibilities. And then we created, also with Carl and bid support, a pre-regulated plan. So if you were going to buy one of these buildings, we could say to you, here's what you need to do in your storefront. There'll be these types of windows, these 4 choices, these kinds of regulation on the stonework. So there was a sense of predictability of how you would be regulated. And then finally, together with the bid, we approached the federal government and got what was then called an ICE-T grant, the grant to support preservation. The city of New York matched that grant, so it was $800,000 each by the city and the feds. And the bid put in about another $150,000. And with that money, we did the historic amenities. So that beautiful Belgian block and a lot of the bluestone paving and those wonderful historic streetlights were all brought to owners. And so we could say to the owners, we're bringing you these historic amenities. You need us. Restore your properties in the way that we've laid out at Landmarks. The bid will work with you to make sure you get the right businesses and the right customers. And now you can go on Stone Sea on a Friday night and it's not a stone to stand on. It's just such a flourishing place. So this was, from what, as Carol used the word desperate, this was one of the really most derelict areas of the neighborhood. But so many of those buildings left vacant as they were landmarked, as they were part of the whole historic preservation, as part of economic development. You began to see a turnaround. So it was really one of the great and rewarding things to be part of this movement, and it's so amazing to see it succeed today. So thank you for this opportunity to talk a little about it.
First of all, Carol, I just want to thank you for bringing this group together, and thank you all for coming. But the group up here, Laurie made a reference to the personal relationships. All three of you, as you guys know, are long-standing friends and colleagues, and we've worked together on lots of different efforts, and over many decades. With Carl going back to Times Square, we changed roles and changed seats, but we working together, and the cross-agency, cooperative, team-building effort and dynamics are things that really can't be overstated in terms of how government can actually work. And we're seeing now, sadly, in all sorts of ways, it not working between different levels of government. There's an amazing amount that can be accomplished just by goodwill and confidence and faith and trust between the people who have the responsibilities of doing the jobs. And this, happily, I think, as Laurie mentioned and Jennifer picked up on, the effort to revitalize Lower Manhattan in the mid-90s was very much an example of that. There were very effective, good, constructive personal dynamics between the players involved. And for those who were potentially doubters or people who had different views or were potentially obstructionists, there was always somebody, sometimes all of us, sometimes individuals, who were able to affirm each other's messages, and that led to a lot of things being able to get done that often in other circumstances might not have. And that interagency, as a general dynamic, interagency cooperation, personal trust and respect, a huge intangible, but that is critical to actually getting anything worthwhile done over time in government. And almost everything takes time, and the baton gets passed. Good ideas come from lots of different sources. The revitalization of Lower Manhattan was something that Rudy Giuliani and I had spoken about and discussed prior to Rudy's taking office. It was a clear to-do item on the agenda. Lower Manhattan, and the financial district and the core in particular, had been in decline for quite some time. I don't remember what the exact regulation was and the exact date, but sometime, I think in the early 80s, there was a change in the regulation that banks had to have their headquarters geographically concentrated below Canal Street. And as soon as that financial regulation was repealed, the banks started moving, if not en masse, but rapidly to Midtown Manhattan or to other locations, for a variety of reasons, one of which was a lot of their labor force, including their senior executives, lived either in Connecticut or places that took the train into Grand Central, and they had zero interest in extending the commute by the length of time and the inconvenience that it took to get to Lower Manhattan. So the quality, the economic forces, which are of course exacerbated by the financial crises and downturns in the late 80s, had been at work for quite some time before. Meanwhile, from a regulatory environment, we had what I used to call gray flannel zoning. It was a 9-to-5 environment. Everybody was bankers' hours. Bankers keeping bankers' hours, doing what they did. You had all the scenes of the traders on Wall Street screaming at each other and all that kind of stuff. But it was the regulatory environment was very much a relic of a completely different era. And one of the things that became clear, in addition to the fact that there were serious infrastructure and geographic issues, it was not an environment that as it became clear, starting in the 80s and was clear by the time of the 90s, people, office workers, and especially the people who made decisions, real estate decision makers for corporate tenants, wanted to be in a place that had amenities. They wanted street life, they wanted restaurants, they wanted activities. They did not want the regulatory environment, which was the environment that we had. I used to, when we were talking about this in the 90s, I used to refer to the fact that this was a place that you could actually, and they did, and before special effects, they would have back when people watched TV, and people bought TV commercials, but you would have commercials, television commercials for banks, but I guess no one would take out TV commercials of any kind, but had bulls or lions or running around Lower Manhattan, and you could not do that now. But I mean, at the time, it was perfectly fine. Yeah, we'll have the lions running around Lower Manhattan because there wasn't anybody there off hours. So the challenge was very clear: take this regulatory environment, trash the regulatory environment, working with landmark, identify what regulations were important to maintain, but create a mixed-use environment and try to address the very real economic challenges. And so we, working together, and I have to say the partnership with Carl is well known. Carl doesn't need to be praised any more than he already he already is. But Carl's a master at forging coalitions and working both in front of and behind the scenes and getting all the different parties that need to be at the table feel that they're being addressed and being comfortable. We had a real cooperation between the private sector, the public agencies, the different branches of government, and we came together, and it really was a great coalition to adopt, to draft and then implement a Lower Manhattan revitalization plan. From the, you've heard a lot, and you'll hear more. I won't go into great detail, but we had from the city planning side, in addition to working and coordinating the different efforts, there were a couple of critical things, and they came in over time because some required the uniform land use review procedure, some required state legislation. So different things kicked in over different times. But the critical things in 1995, we adopted the 421G package, which created economic incentives for and both tax benefits for the conversion of obsolete, and they were functionally obsolete commercial buildings into for residential use, and involved a series of tax abatements and refunds. It was a very muscular tax incentive program to reward people, owners, for taking steps to adaptively reuse existing buildings. We also allowed for those provisions to apply to new residential construction, new construction as well. We also, some of the mechanisms that were in place did not apply for buildings that were built between 1961 and 1977, which at the time was a little strange to think of them as functionally obsolete, but they were. They were those buildings, a lot, or at least some of them, simply did not have the capacity to be repositioned as first-class commercial buildings. And then we did a special Lower Manhattan district that allowed for mixed-use residential, got rid of the great final zoning. I'm not sure if it was a Paisley zoning or it was a casual Fridays. It was a come as you are to allow, and this is I'd say the market to work. So the market needed some spurs, it needed some coaxing, it needed there were things that needed to be protected, and part of it was finding a balance. And I think this is a critical point of some of the most successful things that have worked, whether it's at Times Square or other areas we've all been involved in, but Flatiron Unions, figuring out how to protect the best of the old, welcome in and accommodate the new, work within the context of the market, because by and large, not always, and usually as a last resort. But government is not the best architect. Government is not the best provider of new, innovative, exciting experiences and the like. And for good reason. That's not what governments are around to do. But creating a economically viable regulatory and tax structure that allowed for the private initiatives to really take off has been that. All that structure was laid in the 1990s, and all these kind of things, especially, sometimes you get to point to some dramatic successes. And Stone Street was a dramatic success, and there were a couple of things you could point to and say, look, boy, there's an incident. It's always nice when something happens right away. And, with East Midtown, you had one Vanderbilt that was all poised, and but things. It's always good to have something that can come running out, but the real fact is most things of any significance.
Well, as you can all tell, the theme here is that this is a reunion of sorts, Laurie, Jennifer, Joe, and myself. And the theme really has been a spirit of cooperation and coordination that is sadly lacking today in at least between levels of government, and something that the public deserves and really needs. I'm just going to say a few things because I really want to get into the discussion. Of all the things I've done in my life, I'd have to say that Stone Street is my favorite project and really brings a smile to my face. And largely that was the pleasure of working with Joe and Jennifer on it, and the way that I think that Stone Street really did in an unprecedented way advance how landmarking can drive economic development and how economic development can drive landmarking, and particularly the notion of bringing a degree of certainty to landmarking, which Jennifer clearly did. But there are two other reasons why I love Stone Street, in addition to seeing how successful it's been and how unique it still is, and how I work with developers and cities around the world, and I cannot tell you how many times they sort of wistfully say, if only we could turn the street into a Stone Street. It's become sort of iconic. But for me, it's sort of special for one reason, because in many ways it was the first bid in the world. The property owners on Stone Street, because Stone Street was flooded all the time, went to City Hall in the what passed for City Hall in the late 1680s, I think, and said, "Can you pave our street?" And the city government said, "Absolutely not." Whereupon the property owners got together and paved it themselves and paid for it themselves, thus establishing the principle of bids, which has continued to this day. And then the second thing that's just worth noting, because the success of Stone Street transcends even the Giuliani administration, because I think we have to give a shout out to the Bloomberg administration as well, because what was sort of exquisite timing is that Stone Street opened just about the same time that the Bloomberg administration banned indoor smoking. And so Stone Street opened in the spring, and voila, where could people smoke but outside on Stone Street? But I want to talk about a few other things that Joe mentioned. One, and this is so important, when I started in Lower Manhattan in 1994, and as Carol mentioned, the vacancy rate was close to 30%. And it was because you had a feeling among businesses that which business was going to be the last one to turn out the lights here. And it was clear that a different approach was required. When I was, like Laurie, I was a refugee from the Lincoln's administration and came to the Downtown Alliance. And when I was at EDC, we were recognizing that downtown was in deep trouble and needed help, and we went. I went to the Department of Finance and said, we really have to give some tax incentives here to jumpstart the Lower Manhattan economy. And the city was in very bad financial straits at the time. We're in the middle of the Deep Depression, and the finance department and the budget department said absolutely not. And to the credit of the Giuliani administration, it boldly did give very, very deep tax incentives to jumpstart the conversion of older buildings to residential use. And I can't stress how important and how critical that was. And the reason, in part, that it was essential is because many of these buildings were not only frozen in time, but frozen in finance, because they were owned by insurance companies, they were not owned by banks. They were not required to mark their buildings to market the way banks are. And so it was preferable to insurance companies to keep their buildings vacant rather than sell them at a reduced price, where they would have to recognize that reduced price on their books. So they were just waiting somehow for lightning to strike. And fortunately, because of the very deep tax incentives in Lower Manhattan, lightning did strike, and they were able to convert their buildings to residential use. And I cannot tell you how skeptical the public was, particularly the press. I will pull New York Times article after New York Times article, which first said, well, this is a fine idea, but who's going to buy one of these buildings to convert it to residential use in Lower Manhattan? It's not going to happen. And then, of course, people did buy these buildings, did convert them to residential use, and the Times would write follow-up stories saying, no one's going to finance these buildings, it can't work. And of course they did finance these buildings, and it did work, and then the Times started writing stories saying, well, no one's going to move into Lower Manhattan. And people did move in, and then the Times would write and say, well, these are only kids who are moving into Lower Manhattan. They're here for a year. They're working in the investment banks, and there's no support services for them. So there's no families. No one's going to stay here. No one. This is a lost cause. And in fact, that wasn't the case. Although when we would occasionally, I must admit, when we would occasionally show conversions to prospective new owners. I remember one day going to 45 Wall Street, one of the earliest conversions, going from door to door. It was about noontime, and knocking on one door, and there were a group of J.P. Morgan bankers having a pizza party at 12 noon in their apartment, much to their embarrassment. But I think the key, and this is there were fewer people in 1960 living in Lower Manhattan than were living here in 1800. And even in 1994, there were essentially just two places in Lower Manhattan where people were living. A small contingent was living in Battery Park City, which had not been fully built out yet. And middle-class housing existed in Southgate, Mitchell, and there's nothing in between. And what Lower Manhattan really demonstrated, not just to revival of Lower Manhattan, didn't just revive Lower Manhattan, but did, I think, two other critical things that really set the standard for a changing view toward zoning and toward how people lived. Instead of segmenting uses by use, it recognized that mixed-use communities were going to be the most vibrant, and that was really a critical change, mostly from the way planners had been thinking for a long time in terms of separating uses: commercial here, manufacturing there, residential somewhere else. Second, Lower Manhattan became the model for the transformation of older downtowns throughout the United States. Lower Manhattan was the capital of the age of capitalism, but that role had really been exhausted by the 1990s. And Lower Manhattan became the model by which older downtowns throughout the United States began to reinvent themselves. And like so many things, Lower Manhattan and New York created a model for the rest of the country, if not the world. And then I'll just say one final thing, which is about commuting. Joe had mentioned that so many of the decision makers did live in Westchester or Connecticut or, at worst, the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And the thought of commuting to Lower Manhattan was anathema to them. And I thought when I came to Lower Manhattan that the most important thing to get done was to bring Metro North downtown. That was really going to be the critical thing. But as it turns out, the critical thing was bringing residents downtown because, in fact, the locational decision makers were the ones that moved downtown. And so today what we see are the CEOs of businesses that are living downtown, walking to work, growing their businesses downtown, and that is really what has created the very vibrant community we have today.
When you study transformations of cities, because of a confluence of factors. And what you have here in these stories is a confluence of very productive government action, okay, joined with cooperative trust. I mean, and Joe said it quite well, and it can't be underestimated, because if you look at what happened at Ground Zero after 9/11, it is the absolute antithesis, and it's a story of what happens when there is no trust, there is no cooperation, and there's just everybody fighting for a little piece of their turf to make their mark. And so what's extraordinary about the stories you've heard tonight is that these were people who, because they shared similar values and trusted each other, agreed to work together, my guess is almost seamlessly, and solve problems. They weren't looking for if there was a problem, it was going to be solved. And I think that that what you've heard tonight created an incredibly strong foundation for the ability of the city to rebuild Lower Manhattan after 9/11, because a lot of the fundamentals that they talked about were already in place. And I just want to give you, I'm an academic, I'll give you a little data to support the points they're making about the number of conversions. Between 1995 and 1999, there were almost 3,500 new residential units put in place. And then after 2000, between 2000 and 2005, there were another 7,000, and that's only up to 2005. When you have people living downtown, you have all the things that Carl explained about the change from viewing. I love Joe's term about gray flannel zoning. That really captures it. They're only here from 9 to maybe 7. And it's people living downtown that make the city and make a neighborhood. The question I have for really everyone, but especially Laurie and Jennifer, is when Carol was sort of laying this all out for me, she said, Jennifer, you really captured the sense of that there was a change possible, that there was a change in the way of thinking about the role of preservation. And so the question I have for you is, would the landmarking have been as effective in changing the way developers look at possibilities in a positive way instead of a negative way, had we not had the Giuliani incentives for the 421G conversions, because it was the people that would create the demand, the new demand for downtown living. So these two things are coming together, and I'd be interested in your view on how you were looking at the marketing of the idea changed developers' perspectives, for office, or was the whole game all about residential?
I think the incentives were very important. I think that if somebody was going to use one of those properties for an office, that tax break probably wouldn't have changed them, and nor would the extra year for preservation. But I do want to go back to a point I made earlier, which was I think it's a mistake in public policy that there's actually not more tax support for preservation, because it is, there's a little bit in sort of some federal tax, but it's so hard, really hard, almost impossible to access, right? And it's an interesting thing because it's such a clear public good when you put the stoop back on your brownstone, or you buy one Wall Street and preserve it. So something like One Wall Street is not residential. So it was a real mix, and that was still landmarked, and that was restored. So to your question, I think it was a mix, and I think you clearly got a push from the tax break in some cases. But I do think it was something that I even still would like to see more of, the sort of recognition that preservation is such a great public good, great contribution, but that comes at often can be at least some personal cost, and that was important. But I would say that there were other areas in the city as a control group where the theory of economic development pushing historic preservation was actually also able to be accomplished not without a tax break. And I would use Ladies Mile, which Laurie was very instrumental in the beginning, and then that continued. So who would have thought that another set of white elephant buildings in 6th Avenue in the 20s, which were really empty, and then big box retail comes in, Old Navy, and you start without the tax breaks, but there was a great recognition of support in the city. We gave a lot of awards, and there was a lot of push to restore another set of white elephant buildings. So the tax breaks are great, but we've actually seen this push of, I want to shop someplace historic, I want to be somewhere historic, that it's a little bit as marketing as well.
Yeah, well, I think what it is that the values of people who are living in city-state, they want an experience. I mean, I hate to use it, it's an overused term, but it's true. They want something other than a white box. They want to live in something different. But I do think that the point you made several points earlier, was that you gave developers flexibility to reconfigure and to revision the space without being dogmatic and rigid. And I think the perception of preservation is that it's dogmatic and rigid.
And as I said, that is something I think some of us were talking, there's a new set of rules coming to landmarks. Some of us are seeing that as a continuation of the flexibility. Some are more concerned if you lose all control. But that has always been the sense. Why are people so concerned when someone says we're going to landmark your building? They're concerned I won't be able to. So if you give them a menu of options, actually you will be able to. Some of that tension dissipates.
So,
I just want to say, because Jennifer mentioned Ladies Mile, and going back to with Laurie on the preservation, I was chair of the community board at the time, but these were all, as I said, we've worked together for a long time. A lot of the things that Ladies Mile, I think, demonstrated was, and there was a huge amount of resistance on the part of owners to being designated in the promise, and it was really, Laurie and Landmarks deserves a lot of credit for it, and there were those of us who were saying, wagging fingers, saying, you better follow through on this, and they did, which was to administer the preservation regulations with a view towards accommodating the reuse, and not looking as an opportunity to say no all the time, but to figure out how to work cooperatively to get to yes, which doesn't mean that it makes everybody happy, especially people who aren't acclimatized to working within that kind of a preservation regulatory environment. But it really did begin to transform the approach and the attitude towards preservation on behalf of many of the more enlightened aspects of the property.
Joe, while you're at the mic, do you want to talk a little bit about the initiatives on the east side, the East River side, Lower Manhattan, and how they factor into this, discussion?
Well, there are, and some of those are Carl's that subsequently the east side, Lower Manhattan, and this is the post 9/11. I think lots of money, and you mentioned some of the reasons why things, at least some of it, a lot was accomplished, but a lot that could or should have been accomplished was not. I think there were some real opportunities that were missed in terms of addressing some of the transportation access issues related to the core. Huge amount, there became, in the wake of 9/11 and the rebuilding efforts, a kind of obsession with governmental-led and inspired monumentality, as opposed to the kind of core functional investments that could have really transformed or taken Lower Manhattan, especially the east side and the east side commercial properties that weren't going to be converted, but to real Class A office space, which would have been there are a whole series of things we were working on and talked about, extending the Atlantic branch of the Long Island Railroad down into Lower Manhattan, figuring out ways to really integrate the Lower Manhattan into the regional transportation network better, which if you're throwing if we didn't have the luxury, and it was a tragic event that brought about those funds, but to think in terms of expenditures of billions of dollars. If billions of dollars were going to be expended in Lower Manhattan, I think there were a lot more effective ways that they could have been done than what was done, but I will defer to.
I want to comment on something. In the Giuliani administration, I at the time was working at the Guggenheim, and I was a deputy director in charge of special projects, and the special projects was one special project, building the Guggenheim downtown at the South Street Seaport. I don't know why, I'm always in the middle of some controversy, and it was, but we this wonderful, incredibly creative man, Peter Lewis, who has since passed, who's head of Progressive Insurance, basically said, Frank Gehry said, I got my MacArthur from Peter Lewis, and he had designed this building to a new house for him in Ohio. And when they went out to bid, it was $85 million for a one-bedroom house. But it really became Bilbao and really the Guggenheim. And Joe, who was always pushing my buttons and pushing, like, if you're going to really want to get this through with Giuliani, you've got to do this. You made us so much smarter. And you took us to task, and you were willing to make the effort to make this happen. I'll never forget, we were at a meeting at it was right before 9/11. We were at a meeting with Giuliani, you, Frank Gehry, and Tom Krenz, and where Peter Lewis had pledged $250 million. That was his first pledge. And he said, I'll do more, but I want people to respond. And the city, at the time, I remember Joe Loda was there. I think he had offered $65 million. It was a lot of money. It still is a lot of money, but it was astounding. And I remember the mayor saying, we're going to announce this. And everybody's very excited. He says, but the mayor says, but I'm going to announce it. Not in your time. And I want to warn you that if you go forward and you announce this, you're not going to get it. So you leave the meeting and everything, and Frank Gehry is jumping up and down, and Tom Krenz, and they're about to have this big event at the Guggenheim, and I said, I'm going to be following you guys, because you are worse than little girls. You cannot be trusted. And I know you're going to announce something, and you are going to lose it, believe me. Ask Joe Lewis, and you knew, Frank, you've got to tell, I remember saying, they are going to blow it. And right after the 9/11 and the tragedy, I remember saying, they said, well, this is never going to happen. Richard Grasso was totally against this project. And now, of course, he was always concerned that there was going to be terrorism at this new Guggenheim, it was so big. And I remember saying, this is the time. We are going to build this. This is exactly what we should be doing. You have the Giuliani administration. They're still behind you. You'll build it smaller. But nobody had the faith to continue. But it would have been up and ready. It would have been done way before the World Trade Center. It could have been done.
Well, I want to ask Carl, a couple of times in the conversation, we've mentioned 9/11 and the tragedy. And the tragedy had an unforeseen but fortuitous benefit for New York City, which is $20+ billion that the feds gave to the city, somewhat reluctantly after President Bush's pledge. But nonetheless, it was almost 21 billion that came to the city, most of which was spent downtown. Carl, as a member of the long-serving member of the LMDC,
The longest now.
Development Corporation, I have the numbers, and just talk about the importance of how that money was spent, in particular the initial housing grants, which you impressed upon me was so critical to keeping people and attracting new residents to downtown, because it's part of why the foundation was so important that what happened before 9/11 that we've heard tonight.
Well, as you said, Lynn, yes, $21 billion goes a long way to saving a community. And that $21 billion really was crucial, I'd say, largely, but not entirely, it was spent wisely. The most important decision that was made, which had never been made before, was to give grants to the residents who lived in Lower Manhattan, to keep them in Lower Manhattan. And that was essential because that was, to me, a sign to the business community that Lower Manhattan would be saved. If the residents were prepared to move back, then the businesses could move back. If the residents had not moved back, and there were lots of reasons why the residents wouldn't have moved back, and those of you who remember the days right after 9/11 know that Lower Manhattan was really an armed camp. It was with fires burning, with smells, with no services. It was really pretty rough. And the fact that the residents, for the most part, stayed was, I think, probably the most critical decision that was made, and I think the most important and best investment of the $21 billion that was made. I just want to echo one thing that Joe said, which is that the one really lost opportunity to me in Lower Manhattan with that $21 billion was the failure to create a link railing to the airports. We still don't have a link to Newark, which still is in theory on the drawing boards. We certainly don't have a rail link to Kennedy for a modern world city. That's really disgraceful, and that was the opportunity to do it. And Lynne has heard me say this before, but we have $5 billion or so that was spent on an Oculus in Lower Manhattan, and as the late John Zuccotti always and wistfully said, we have built ourselves a great train station. If only we had a great train to put into it. And that is true, and sadly, that can apply to many other kinds of developments, but none so directly as Lower Manhattan.
If I can just,
1 second, to give you some sense of the dollars here, what Carl was referring to was almost $240 million into the housing residential grant program. That's a lot of money at that point in time. But the money also went into parks, streets and transportations, a lot into community and support of cultural institutions to provide for lack of a better word, the soft but critical infrastructure for people living here, and to, one of the things that we learned at Times Square in the redevelopment of 42nd Street when that stalled was that you can never let the absence of activity take over, that you have to maintain a momentum of activity while things are new things are put in place. And so I think that the money spent on to support a wide number of community and cultural organizations was really critical to and complementary to the support of residents coming downtown. Joe?
Yes, and can I say one other thing, Lynne, which is that, the the Lower Manhattan, the World Trade Center site was really, as you know better than anybody, was really controlled largely by the Port Authority and the state of New York and New Jersey. And to the credit, I think, of particularly the Bloomberg administration, building on what had happened pre-9/11, it used its somewhat limited influence to focus on the area outside of the World Trade Center itself. And that was really, I think, the money that, including obviously the residential grants, the money that was best spent.
I would agree with that, and I think there's, part of it is, and it goes back to what was done before, done subsequent, is sort of the stone soup aspect of when you don't have vast amounts to throw around, you really try to get bang for your buck and hold yourself and each other accountable and look at really what's going to make a difference. And I think Carl referred to the Oculus, which I think is leave aside the design issues and whether it's, you like it or not, obscene amount of money, and to take some of the lessons going forward to the extent that we don't figure out collectively and demand that we spend our money more, the money that we wisely, effectively get bang for the buck. All these all the grand plans and infrastructure and the issues going forward are really, we're not going to have those opportunities. And I think that if we don't collectively, at all levels of government, figure out how not to have repeats of that kind of a situation,
Sounds like
we're
an op-ed.
never going to get anything done.
So I want to
I'm going to give everybody a last, we're out of time, but I think everybody,
So I want to
Please,
say
one last time
an
if it's
optimistic point to Joe's and something that you said, Carol, which I don't think was completely accurate. There was this crazy idea on the stock exchange, but it didn't have traction. It was never going to happen. And Rudy never, I mean, I was in that room and I said, you're not supporting this. So I can say that Rudy was never going to support this. I mean, Dick Grass,
Times said that they were though, right?
it was not going to happen. I mean, and
It's
it
never
was,
going to happen.
it was never
Rudy
gonna
supported it, but it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, okay.
But we had to go through the exercise.
But then Rudy didn't, because we started to talk about moving it to Battery Park City, and we were going to rename part of Battery Park City Wall Street. But it was talk about boondoggles, and then it was this idea of putting the stock exchange into a big glass box over Wall Street. And Grasso had all these ideas about the security issues. It was one of the, just talk about the most iconic street in American history where Federal Hall is, was going to be in a glass box. So that could have, but it actually didn't happen, so that was a good thing.
There are a lot of good things that didn't happen.
I want to thank you, Carol, for getting us all together, and really everybody has to go and support Skyscraper Museum and not forget how great this city is and where it all began down here. And the exhibition is fantastic.
That's what I think.